Welcome to Not Stopping for Directions, a podcast for and about dads, especially those parenting children with behavioral health challenges. I'm your host, Michael Carmen, and this podcast is brought to you by the Kentucky Partnership for Families and Children. The content included should not take the place of clinical or medical advice and are purely points of discussion for you to consider during your parenting journey. Well, welcome to Not Stopping for Directions. This is episode number 10. I am Mike Carmen, and today we're speaking with Dean Justin J. Miller, who is the Dean and Dorothy A. Miller Research Professor in Social Work Education at the UK College of Social Work. Did I get all of that right, Dean Miller?
You got it all right. Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. There was a lot of Millers in that sentence and a couple Deans, so it gets a little confusing. Just diving right into some questions here. I noticed on your profile page at the university website, you have a variety of focus areas in your work, including systems that impact youth, foster care, juvenile justice, and self-care. Kind of working backwards from that list, can you tell me a little bit about your self-care initiative and maybe even how that dovetails with your other areas of focus?
Yeah, and I think that's the interesting thing is that kind of reading it on a page, you kind of walk through the list and you're like, hold on, what? It seems very spans this big continuum. And interestingly, I've found and actually got into it because it's a lot more connected than most folks think. Of course, growing up, I spent time in out-of-home care, foster care, kinship care, etc. And decided at a very young age I was going to go be a CPS worker. Right now, I would say nobody in life has ever said they're going to set out to be a CPS worker. This is not a thing. But because of my personal experiences, it's something I wanted to do. And as I got into that space and I began to practice, and I was very kind of set on doing the work a certain way, I found myself reaching a point where, you get kind of burned out. You don't hear the stories the same way. You can't work it up to quote unquote care in the same way you used to. And so one day it just kind of struck me. It's like, if I really want to impact and help kids and families, maybe I should focus on the people working with them as a way to say, let's think about the workforce that we have tasked with dealing with and engaging with these children and families. And so it got me into this self-care space. Now, I often joke, I said, okay, I'm going to get into this space. I'm going to write some stuff, do a little bit of work, and then I'm going right back to, doing research in foster care and things like that.
Sure.
And I've been trying to run away from it ever since, because it's the thing that you start to realize it transcends any agency, organization, practice context, even profession. We tend to think about social workers, but you have first responders and public defenders and all kinds of other folks in this mix that we need to make sure are well as they engage with the community. And so launched the self-care lab. Now, if I had $1 for every time somebody told me, no, you shouldn't do that, it's a bad idea, I would have been retired a few years ago. But in that space, it's allowed me, us, our college to really focus on, the system, whatever that means, in a way that is supportive and understanding the complexities of the workforce. And then perhaps most importantly, understanding how those complexities will impact the services we're able to offer.
Sure.
If you just think about self-care from a very simplistic standpoint, if you are working or engaging with a family and you are tired and burned out and jaded and high caseload, all those things, there's no way you're giving the best service possible. You might be doing a really good job and you might be doing the best you can do, and nothing should be taken away from that. However, I think investing in a workforce means we can invest in our work a different way, and it means that we'll get to better or different outcomes.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I'd like to unpack that a little bit more, Dean Miller, if we can. Thinking think again about self-care, and you kind of touched on this a little bit, just sharing a little personal information. My wife and I were foster adoptive parents, and we are now kinship caregivers raising our grandchild who's 19 months old. Um, but during our parenting years, the first go around, our children had a lot of behavioral health concerns, and self-care came up a lot. And you kind of talked about caseworkers and caseloads. Um, so the question becomes when? When do you get to take care of yourself if you're dealing with crises and putting out fires? And at the end of the day, you may have the best intentions of, oh, I'm going to meditate for 30 minutes, or I'm going to read a book, or I'm going to journal, or I'm going to go out and get some dinner. But, maybe you just wiped out. How do you see and again, this is a systems level question, and I know you recognize that, but how do you start to chip away at that so that the opportunity to engage in healthy self-care can occur?
Yeah, so it's that's an interesting question, but let's if we unpack that and work backwards a little bit, because
Hmm.
it the question speaks to one of these big myths about the way that people think about self-care.
Hmm.
And what if I told you that self-care is both, I call it prevention and intervention.
Okay.
And what tends to happen is we wait for something to happen or blow up or,
Hmm.
get bad. And then we say, oh, well, let me go do some self-care now. We
Right.
we treat it as a secondary thing to our life. I always say self-care is just a way of being in the world. It's a way that you parent. It's the way that you do the work. It's the way that you engage whatever your business is in a given day.
Hmm.
So we can't, it's not an event, it's an
Hmm.
experience. And so you're right. If we treat self-care as something I'll do when I get time for it, we never get time for it. Um, so it's about thinking, how can I engage in my work in a way that is well and good for me? How can I engage in parenting or caregiving in a way that's good for me? Um, I do want to note, thank you and your partner so much for being foster parents and being kinship caregivers. Like me having my own personal experience, I think that that is a thing that folks don't get enough gratitude for. So I'm thankful for you
Thank you, Dean.
all being able and agreeing and being open to doing that. Um, but how do you parent in a way, like if you're a foster parent, like sometimes that might mean saying no to that placement. Sometimes, and,
Hmm.
and it's not always the easy thing to do, but we have to approach whatever it is we're doing, casework, foster parenting, or otherwise, from the standpoint of knowing the importance of self-care and having it be an integrated experience in the way that we live, not a secondary ancillary. People will often use the whole mask metaphor on a plane, right? Like you're on
Sure.
a plane and the mask pop down, you always put yours on first. That's kind of silly if you think about it, because if the mask popped down, something is already wrong.
Right. Good point.
So what if we looked at it as prevention to say that will keep me from experiencing being tired or burned out or stressed or whatever it may be. Um, it's we got to fundamentally reframe the way we think about this concept of self-care. It's not something you go by. It's not something that just happens on its own, and it's not something that can be secondary. It's not a
Right.
nicety, it's a necessity. And I think that's really important to understanding and getting to a strategy of how we engage in it in a meaningful way.
So how are you? So as you describe it, it's not an event, it's an integration, right? You're integrating self-care into your daily routine, into how you parent or how you case manage. Um, the lab you referenced, how are you utilizing that to teach this or bring this about, if you will? Kind of walk me through what what's happening there, I guess I'd say.
Yeah, so I would say, when I developed the lab, is the first place in the world dedicated to the empirical investigation of self-care. Meaning I set out to really examine and explore the science of self-care, not just for the sake of knowing. I have no interest in doing things just to know something, although that's important. I want to
Sure.
do them to then act. So
Hmm.
what does that mean, right? And so through some of those initiatives, I got to the point of doing and offering these trainings and intervention pieces and working with different groups and folks around just kind of reframing the way people think about self-care and then strategizing about ways to integrate it into whatever it is, whatever the work is that you may be doing. And so we do a lot of things. I just a couple of weeks ago, I was out talking to a group and I did a training on, for them to think about strategies for engaging in these groups or communities of self-care. So what does it mean
Hmm.
to work with a team? What does it mean for you and your partner to be thinking about how to be well? We talk a lot about, I call them critical friends, right? Like, do you have people around you who can help you when sometimes you might not see it yourself? Um, and I think that in sharing those strategies, assessing and researching how they may work for some groups and not others, a lot of it is demystifying the concept of self-care, but then also like really tearing down the myths. Like, a lot of folks,
Hmm.
they view self-care as being selfish. I can't take time off because the people need me too much.
Right.
Um, and I've been there. When I set out to go work for CPS, you could not tell me that I wasn't going to save all of the kids. And I
Mm.
mean that literally. Like, that's
Right.
what I thought in my mind I was going to do. Now you hear how ridiculous that sounds, right? Like, there's no way you can save. And if that's my metric of success, I will never succeed.
Right.
So we really focus and work with people on kind of tearing down the existing concepts of how we think about self-care and wellness. I do think normalizing stress is part of it. I think
Right.
I work with a lot of families or parents, and it's almost as if they think that they should have this big stress-free thing. And it's like, nope, parenting can be stressful, right? Like
Right.
and so normalizing that, letting folks know that it shouldn't be persistent and all the time. But I think that goes a long way. I remember when I was in care, as a kid, for years, I thought I was the only one this has ever happened to.
Right.
And I distinctly remember the day that I met another young person who was in foster care, kinship care, and how interestingly refreshing that was to me to know I wasn't the only one. And I think when you
Right.
think about parenting or caregiving, a lot of times you take foster parents, for example, you're kind of in these isolated buckets and you try to connect, but you got a whole bunch of things going on and you can feel guilty or you think you're the only one dealing with something. And turns to find out you're not. It's a very common thing. And I think there's power in recognizing and normalizing some of it. Again, not that it makes it better or that you should have to experience it. It just helps people see it a different way.
Right. Right. Um, let's talk a little bit about trauma, um, if we can. That's as a concept, I guess you would say, has been something that has been understood in social service circles, perhaps, and education a little bit. It's starting to creep into, I work in workforce development. Employers are starting to learn about trauma and how to deal with trauma. But I'm wondering, again, just kind of thinking through the self-care element, um, in the context of recent events. So we're talking a global pandemic, which I feel like we're trying to act like that didn't happen. It was just a blink of an eye ago, but we're already trying to forget that it happened, and you can't do that with trauma, right?
Yeah.
Um, so COVID, I'm in Louisville. We're the community of Breonna Taylor. Um, that's a community trauma, uh, racial trauma, generational trauma. Um, how do you address that in the context of self-care?
Well, so I would say first and foremost, by engaging and knowing and understanding this kind of integration of self-care, it helps you more effectively deal with those things. So it's kind of like, you go into it a certain way, will help you and assuage the impacts of some of those things. It's like if you're going to go run a marathon, it would behoove you to do some running before that. That means you're going to handle the marathon a little better, right?
Right.
So I think it's so important because in the instances you talk about, it's kind of like the thing has happened and then we try to respond, or I would
Right.
say a better descriptor would be to be react. I say
Mhm.
we can respond by preparing for stress or traumatic events, whatever they may be. And part of the foundation for that is self-care. And then I think number two, COVID is like yesterday for me. I have an 8 and a 10-year-old, and I am into education. Every day of my life is spent in education and academia, and I see them, and I see the difference in how everything from like reading to math to socialization looks different. And I have to remind myself, they spent a couple years like not in school and trying to Zoom
Right.
lessons. And I think there's a concept I talk about a lot called toxic positivity, right? Where we
Mm.
kind of cheerlead and cheerlead and cheerlead, and
Right.
because it's
Right.
the thing we think we're supposed to do. But I don't know that that all went as well as we think it might have. And I'm speaking specifically to some of these academic spaces where you had to pivot real quick. And it's not that people weren't doing a good job or that they weren't trying and doing everything they could do. But
Right.
let's normalize a little bit. That was something that none of us anticipated, expected, and knew how to deal with. Like we were
Right.
all figuring it out as we were going. So, you know, it, having these, I call it like these keep it real discussions where we allow people to kind of fumble through some of the things. We allow people to talk about and share their perspective of how it was impacted. Um, I don't want to get overly social worky in the concept of that helps people deal and cope. And I do think folks, if we allow them the space, it can be a lot more resilient than we think. And so we don't want to compound these issues sometimes by
Hmm.
continuing to do the things. And I do think there's a lot of power in the normalization of community. I'd say, my 8-year-old, her name is Noor, my 10-year-old son, his name is Z. And I uh, adore them in ways that I have not words to describe. And I got a whole bunch of words, right? I just like, and I remember when I was younger and people would talk about kids, I'm like, whatever, you don't really understand what it means when somebody
Right.
is describing it to you. There's nothing I would not do for them. I would walk to the ends of the earth through all of the fires, all of the things I would do. And sometimes they get on my nerves.
Right. Right.
And that's okay. Like that's a normal thing. But we don't make it okay. We don't, it's like you got to feel a certain way about that. Two things can be true at the same time.
Sure.
Particularly I think in parenting and caregiving. So in dealing with the trauma pieces, number one, going into it a certain way, meaning knowing that we're important and that our wellness is important and that being well will help us deal with things as it moves through. And then number two, having some kind of normative, and I don't mean normative in the sense of these incidents or events should be normal. I mean
Hmm.
normative in the sense of we are all having a reaction, and we'll have different reactions depending on how we think about the thing, but it is all a reaction, normalizing the concept of therapy or counseling or treatment or processing. Like that should be a normal thing. I think sometimes it's
Right.
compounded. You think about these community incidents that may happen, they may impact communities of color, et cetera. We also know there's a stigma around communities of color and mental health, or so you mix those things together and it's just a bad recipe.
Right.
So how do we now demystify or destigmatize these mental health services or mental support services so that if something does happen, we go into it a different way?
Right.
And so You
Making
can't,
it, in a sense, these are things that are okay to talk about. We can talk about these things, right? I think that's part of the stigma, right? Is it's like I'm not even going to air this. I'm not even going to express this. I'm going to let it stew inside of me.
yeah, yeah, let's say that backwards. Let's say we make it not okay to not talk about. I
Right.
think is a different way. Because if we got to make it okay, that's kind of like we have to take an action to do it. But it's like I don't have to tell you it's okay to breathe for you to know you
Right.
got to breathe.
Hmm.
So this is a
Well
similar
said.
thing to where it just becomes normative. Let's make it not okay to not. And then I think it really empowers people to do it.
Yeah, I like the way you put that. Well, you mentioned being a parent. I'm curious, does that inform your work? And conversely, does your work inform how you parent? What's the relationship there?
Um, I would be lying to you if I said being a parent shapes how I view the world. So not just my work is part of the world. And so, yes, I think it does. But I'm very, very careful because I think far too often people use their experience as a directive blueprint. If you think about like the child development theories we have now, right?
Hmm.
The old school, the Piagets, the Ericksons, etc. Those were made with them sitting around looking at their kids and then saying, this is how all kids should be.
Right.
And that can be very, very problematic. So, it impacts my work in the sense that I might not have time to do something that I thought I wanted to do. It is informing in the sense of um, I know what it's like. You talk about a workforce thing. I know what it's like to try to schedule a meeting during drop off time, right? Like that looks a little different for folks. I often say the biggest difference between people, it is not race and it is not gender, it is generational.
Mm.
So I find myself I tend to be a lot younger than my colleagues. And so, we'll be in these spaces where um, the challenges are just different, not more or less, just different. And
Hmm.
so it certainly impacts the way I think about the world and as such, my work. I'm always very careful to not make it a directive blueprint. Just because I have experienced something, it does not mean that everyone else will experience the same thing. But I do think sometimes I've found, and I had to learn this, that me sharing my experience sometimes, even telling you that like, hey, sometimes the kids will get on my nerves, right?
Mm.
It interestingly then starts to make it okay for other people to talk about in the same way. So I do think that it can shape experiences in that way. But for sure, it impacts all aspects of me and who I am in both ways. And I think that that can be a really, really good thing. And like I said, I try to be careful about um, not prescribing or presupposing, but I also recognize and try to keep people around me who can tell me when I might be or when I am.
Excellent. Well, we're bumping up against time, and I do want to be respectful of your time, but just kind of a last question on a light note. What do you like to do for fun as a family? What are some things that you all get into?
Yeah, we've really gotten into these trail walk situations. I was an athlete, I was a runner, and so the folks, we try to make time, carve out time for that. My 8-year-old now is really into Monopoly. She's learned that she
Mm.
likes to be a banker and control all the money. So, they're really into getting everybody together and keeping these multi-day games going. You leave and you got a certain amount of money in your pile, and you come back and there's a different amount of money in your pile. So we're always looking for life lessons in those things. And then frankly, sometimes like with our lives being so fast, I was sometimes the best self-care is doing absolutely nothing.
Mm.
So we sit and like what movies on, what I mean, and that to me, I think is the best time. So many times we get into having to do something like go here.
Right.
And I don't know about other people. Sometimes to me, going and doing the thing is so much of a hassle that you almost regret wanting to do it.
Right.
Uh,
Right.
but it's perfectly fine to just sit and do nothing. So we watch movies or talk about this or talk about that. And I think to me, the funny thing is they enjoy that just as much as they would anything else.
Right. It's the
So,
time well spent together.
indeed, indeed.
All right, Dean Miller. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us today, and certainly appreciate all the good work you're doing at the University of Kentucky. We'll look to see more great things from you.
All righty. Thanks so much for having me. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Dean.